the alien princess every noble ignored, until a human stepped forward. The chair scraped against the iron floor before I had finished deciding to stand. 10,000 pairs of eyes turned toward me. Some were compound, some were single-lidded, some were arranged in horizontal rows across faces that had no resemblance to anything born on Earth. But every single one of them landed on me in the same fraction of a second, and the weight of that collective attention was something close to physical. I had not planned to stand. I want to be honest about that, because the version of events that reached the news feeds later made it sound like I arrived at the conclave of the Vel-Sharan with a strategy, with a rehearsed moment, with some grand intention to change things. I did not. I arrived with a translated briefing packet I had read twice on the transit shuttle, a dress uniform that did not quite fit across the shoulders, and the assigned seat of a man nobody expected to do anything. Earth's diplomatic attaché to the Vel-Sharan conclave. The title sounded important until you understood what it actually meant. It meant that every senior diplomat in the Galactic Affairs Office had looked at this posting and quietly found a reason to be unavailable. It meant that humanity, 42 years into recognized galactic society, still did not have the political standing to send someone who mattered. It meant me, Callum Voss, formerly Sergeant Callum Voss of the 3rd Colonial Support Battalion, now a mid-level attaché, whose main qualification was that he had once spent 18 months stationed near Vel-Sharan space and learned enough of the language to be dangerous. The chamber was called the Hall of 100 Houses. It was not a metaphor. There were 114 recognized noble houses of the Vel-Sharan conclave, each one occupying a tiered gallery section, with their colors displayed above them, and the hall itself had been carved over 3 centuries from the compressed iron core of a dead star. The walls did not reflect light so much as absorb it, and the air tasted of something between cold metal and the specific kind of quiet that only exists in places where very old power has sat for a very long time. I had arrived early. I always arrived early, a habit left over from the military that I could not shake. I had found my seat in the observer gallery, a section positioned slightly lower than the noble galleries, separated by a rail that was decorative but unmistakably a boundary, and I had watched the chamber fill. It filled slowly, with the kind of deliberate pace that signals an awareness of being watched. Houses entered in order of seniority. Their representatives wore robes and colors registered to their bloodlines, colors that in some cases had not changed in 400 years. The ceremony of it was thorough. You could feel the weight of that many centuries pressing down on the room. I did not yet know what was about to happen. The briefing packet had described the conclave as a general diplomatic assembly, where houses conducted formal business, renewed alliances, and heard petitions. What it had failed to mention, or had mentioned in language so bureaucratic I had not understood it, was that this particular session had been scheduled around a specific petition, a petition of the kind the conclave had not seen in over 60 years. When she walked out onto the petition dais, I noticed her immediately. Not because she was beautiful, though she was, in the way that the Vel-Sharan often were, a people whose faces had a symmetry that seemed slightly more deliberate than nature usually managed, whose skin carried a faint luminescence in certain lights. I noticed her because she was alone. Every other individual who had walked into that hall had done so as part of a group, surrounded by house staff, flanked by advocates and record keepers. She had no one. She walked to the center of the dais, and she stood there in the formal presentation stance, hands visible, head level, and she was entirely, completely alone. The herald's voice filled the chamber. The Vel-Sharan herald was a position held by the same family for 9 generations, and the current holder had a voice that carried without effort, a voice that had been trained since childhood to travel the acoustics of this specific room. He announced her name. Princess Salvin of the House Lunathari, last surviving member of the royal bloodline, petitioner before the conclave. Last surviving member. The hall did not react visibly. The Vel-Sharan noble class had spent centuries learning to keep their faces still in formal settings, but I had been watching people long enough to know the difference between stillness and control, and what I saw in that gallery was control, deliberate, practiced control over a reaction that was there underneath. They knew who she was. They knew her situation. They had known before she walked in, and they had come here anyway, to this scheduled session, in their registered colors, to watch what happened. The herald began the formal recitation of her petition. I will not reproduce the legal language because it was dense with terms that required a law degree in Vel-Sharan jurisprudence to fully parse. But the meaning was not difficult. The Lunathari home system had been destroyed, not damaged, not occupied, destroyed. 12 years ago, a territorial dispute between two major houses had spilled into the Lunathari sector, and the Lunathari people, who were not a party to the dispute, who had no military force to speak of, who had only ever maintained a small and peaceful presence in that region of space, had been caught between them. The home world was gone. The colony stations were gone. The population was gone, reduced in the official records to a number that I sat with in silence for a long moment after I heard it. Selvin had survived because she had been off-world, studying at a diplomatic academy on a neutral station. She had come home to a debris field and a formal notification that her house had been marked inactive in the conclave registry. She was petitioning for recognition, for resources, for a formal finding of accountability, for the right to begin, somehow, the rebuilding of what remained of her people's presence in the galaxy. And so the herald turned to the noble galleries, and he asked, in the formal language of the Kelshar petition rite, which was one of the oldest rituals in Velsharan law, whether any house would stand as sponsor. The first house to respond was the House of Velthoran. They cited a long-standing agreement with one of the houses involved in the territorial dispute. They could not involve themselves in a matter that touched those agreements. They regretted the situation deeply. The second house cited resource constraints. The third cited jurisdictional uncertainty. The fourth said nothing. Their representative simply made a small formal gesture with two fingers, a decline. I watched Selvin's face through all of this. That was the thing that stayed with me afterward, more than anything else in that room. She did not flinch. She did not look at the galleries with pleading or with accusation. She stood exactly as she had stood when she walked in, hands visible, head level, and she watched each refusal arrive with an expression that told me this was not a surprise. She had known this might happen. She had prepared herself for it. She had made the decision to come here and stand on this dais and be refused in front of 1,000 witnesses, because not coming would have meant something worse than refusal. It would have meant disappearance. House after house declined, some with formal language, some with gestures, some with the kind of silence that in Vel-Sharan custom carried its own specific meaning. I lost count around 30. I started counting something else instead. I started counting the bruises I could see beneath the formal face paint she wore. They were faint. You had to be looking, but I had spent enough years in the military to know what someone looks like when they are carrying injuries they are trying not to show. And she was carrying them. She had walked to this dais from somewhere that had not been kind to her, and she had made herself stand straight anyway. The herald began the closing sequence. In the Kelshar rite, the closing sequence was the formal conclusion of the petition process. Once begun, it could not be interrupted except by a sponsor's declaration. Once completed, the petition was formally denied and closed. A closed petition could not be reopened for a period of 30 galactic years. 30 years. I did not think about strategy. I did not think about protocol, or my position, or what my government would say when they received the incident report, or the fact that I had no legal standing in Vel-Sharan law, or any of the 100 things I probably should have thought about. I thought about a mining colony on the edge of the Harath system, where I had grown up watching administrators look away from petition after petition, submitted by people who had nothing left. I thought about what that looking away felt like from the other side of it. I thought about the specific texture of a silence that is not neutral, a silence that is a choice, dressed up as an absence. I stood up. The chair scraped against the iron floor. 10,000 eyes found me. The herald stopped mid-sentence. The closing sequence, for the first time in recorded conclave history, was interrupted by someone from the observer gallery. I did not know the formal declaration language. I used the Vel-Sharan phrase I knew. The one from my 18 months near their space. The one that meant simply and directly, I will stand with her. The hall was very quiet after that. Selvin looked at me for the first time, across the distance of the petition dais, across the rail that separated observers from participants, across 42 years of human history in galactic space, and 400 years of Velsharan law. She looked at me with an expression I could not immediately read. I found out later what the Kelshar Compact was. I found out later what I had actually said, in a legal sense, by speaking those words in that context, during the closing sequence of a formal petition right. I found out later that what I had just done would require 6 months of tribunal hearings, 3 emergency diplomatic sessions, 1 near trade war, and a complete restructuring of how my government approached Velsharan policy. But standing there in that moment, with 10,000 eyes on me, and the herald still frozen mid-sentence, and Selvin watching me from across the dais, I was not thinking about any of that. I was thinking that the silence had gone on long enough. My chair scraped against iron floor, and 10,000 alien eyes found me at once. I had no title to give her. I gave her something rarer. I gave her a witness who refused to look away. The herald did not resume the closing sequence. That was the first sign that something had actually happened, something with weight and legal consequence, rather than simply an embarrassing interruption from the human observer section. In Velsharan formal ceremony, interruptions were handled by the herald continuing the proceedings and addressing the disruption through secondary channels. The herald did not do this. He stood at his podium with his hands flat on the surface in front of him, and he looked at me, and he said nothing. And in that silence, the entire hall recalibrated. I became aware, in stages, of what the silence meant. Not the polite silence of an assembly waiting for a disruption to be managed, but the charged silence of a body of people who have just witnessed something they cannot immediately classify. The Velsharan noble houses had frameworks for almost every situation that could arise in a formal conclave session. They had 4 centuries of precedent, 6 volumes of procedural law, and a professional class of advocates whose entire careers were built on knowing which rule applied to which moment. What they did not have, apparently, was a clear procedure for what to do when a human observer spoke the Kelshar Declaration during a petition closing sequence. The reason I would later understand was simple. It had never happened before. Not because it was legally impossible. The observer status granted to non-Velsharan species technically permitted participation in certain limited right sequences, but because no observer in the history of the conclave had ever been either foolish enough or impulsive enough to try. Ambassador Lyra Gale reached me before anyone else did. She was Earth's senior diplomatic representative, a small, precise woman who had spent 20 years building careful relationships in Velsharan space. And she crossed the observer gallery in a way that managed to look unhurried while covering the distance very quickly. She sat down beside me without looking at me, her eyes forward on the dais, and she spoke in a voice pitched low enough that only I could hear it. She said, "Callum, do you have any idea what you just did?" I told her honestly that I was working on it. She said, "You invoked the Kelshar Compact. You are now legally bound as a named sponsor in a Velsharan petition right. Under the Conclave Charter, a named sponsor accepts shared standing with the petitioner, which means every legal challenge, every diplomatic consequence, and every liability attached to this petition is now also attached to you." And by extension, she added, with a quality in her voice that I recognized as the sound of someone doing mathematics they do not enjoy, to Earth. I looked at Selvin. She was still on the dais, and the herald was now in quiet conference, with 3 senior procedural advocates, who had appeared from somewhere in the rear galleries. She was watching the conference with the same steady composure she had maintained through the entire process. Whatever she felt about what had just happened, it was behind that composure, not visible from where I sat. I said to Ambassador Gale, "Was I wrong? Legally? Can they void what I said?" She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "That is a very good question, and the fact that they have not immediately moved to void it suggests the answer may be no." That was the first moment I understood that I had not simply made an embarrassing scene. I had done something that was at minimum legally ambiguous, and at maximum legally significant, and the body of people best positioned to determine which one it was were currently in urgent conference at the front of the room. The session was suspended. The herald made the formal announcement in language that carefully avoided assigning cause. Procedural recess was the phrase used, and the galleries began the controlled movement of 1,000 people who had something urgent to discuss, and were trained to discuss it without appearing to be in a hurry. I was approached by a conclave procedural officer within 4 minutes. He was polite, formal, and very clear. I was to remain in the observer gallery. I was not to communicate with the petitioner. A legal determination regarding the status of the declaration made during the petition sequence would be issued before the session reconvened. I acknowledged all of this, and he left. Ambassador Gale stayed. She pulled out her personal communication device and began what I assumed was a very uncomfortable transmission to the Home Office. I sat with my hands on my knees and looked at the petition dais, which was now empty. Salvin had been escorted to a side chamber by 2 conclave officials. I did not know then whether that was standard procedure or something else. The legal determination took 4 hours. I spent those 4 hours in the observer gallery with Ambassador Gale, who received 3 separate urgent transmissions from Earth and relayed their content to me with the expression of someone delivering progressively worse news to someone who has already made it worse. The Galactic Affairs Office wanted a full incident report. The Deputy Minister of Diplomatic Affairs wanted clarification on what legal exposure the Compact Declaration created. The Office of the Secretary General wanted to know whether it was too late to formally disavow my action. I told Ambassador Gale to tell them it was too late, yes. She said she had already told them that. When the procedural officer returned, he brought with him a senior advocate in the formal robes of the conclave legal body, and the advocate read the determination in the specific clipped tone that Vel-Sharan legal professionals used for official findings. I will summarize it. The declaration was valid. The Kelshar Compact, under Clause 19 of the Conclave Charter's petition provisions, permitted declaration by any recognized observer party during the closing sequence of a formal rite, provided the declaration was made in correct language before the sequence concluded. I had made the declaration before the sequence concluded. The language I used, while informal, met the legal threshold for the declaration phrase as defined in the original charter. The compact was therefore established. There was a pause after the advocate finished reading. Then he said, in a slightly different tone, that the legal body wished to note that this determination did not address any of the practical or diplomatic complications arising from the situation, only its formal legal status. I said, "Understood." He left. Ambassador Gale looked at me for a long moment. Then she said, "They are going to make this very difficult for you, Calum." I told her I had noticed. What she meant, and what I was beginning to fully understand, was that the noble houses of the Vel-Sharan conclave did not simply accept outcomes they had not anticipated. They had 4 centuries of practice at applying the mechanisms of their own system in ways that produced the results they preferred. The compact was established, yes, but the compact was only the beginning of a process, not the end of one, and there were many stages in that process where complications could be introduced, where delays could be constructed, where a determined coalition of powerful houses could make the practical execution of a legal right feel like an impossibility. I was escorted to a meeting room after that. Salvin was already there. It was a small room, functional rather than formal. A table, chairs of a design that indicated they had been provided with human proportions in mind, which told me the conclave had done at least some preparation for this outcome. Salvin was seated at the far end of the table. The 2 conclave officials who had escorted her were gone. The room contained only her, a small recording device in the corner, and then me. And she waited until I had sat down before she spoke. She said, in standard galactic common, the trade language that most species used when their native tongues were incompatible, "What do you want from this?" It was not an unfriendly question. It was a direct one, asked with the manner of someone who has learned that directness is more efficient than waiting for honesty to arrive on its own. I said I did not want anything from it. She looked at me the way that people look at you when they have heard that answer before and have specific evidence that it is usually not true. I told her, "My people are not complex about this. Some of us just cannot watch someone stand in the middle of a room and get ignored long enough to leave." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Humans are traders. Everyone says so. Your species entered galactic society through commerce. You built your first alliances through trade agreements. There is always something you want." I said, "Sometimes the thing we want is for the person in front of us not to be left alone in a bad situation." I know that sounds simple. It usually is. She studied me across the table. The Vel-Sharan had a particular way of assessing sincerity. A slight stillness that preceded a decision, as though they were processing not just what you said but the physical qualities of how you said it. I sat still and let her do it. Then she said, "The Kelshar Compact binds your standing to mine. If my petition fails, you share the formal record of that failure. It will affect Earth's position in the conclave. Do you understand that?" I said I was starting to understand it, yes. She said, "It is not a small thing." I said, "Neither is what they did to your people." She was very still after that. Not the processing stillness. Something different. Something quieter. She asked me to tell her who I was. Not my title. Not my diplomatic function. That who I was. So I told her. I told her about the Harath system colony, which was one of Earth's early off-world settlements, built when the technology was good enough to sustain life, but not good enough to sustain it comfortably. I told her about the administration boards that would receive petitions from the colony and lose them in the machinery of their own processes. I told her about watching that happen, as a child, and then as a young soldier, and then as someone who had eventually decided that the thing to do with that specific frustration was to go somewhere it might be useful. She listened. So the Vel-Sharan were good listeners. I had heard that, and sitting across from her, I found it was true. Not passive listening, but active, the kind where the attention is obvious and you feel it. When I finished, she said, "The Lunathari people built their cities to make sound, not passively, not the way other species' buildings carry noise. The Lunathari designed structures that produced specific harmonics depending on wind direction, on population density, on the time of day." A Lunathari city was a living instrument. When the population gathered in the central plazas, the city sang with them. I grew up with that sound. It was not background, it was the texture of being home. She said it very simply, without performance. The way you describe something when you are used to it being gone and have made a kind of peace with describing the absence. I said I was sorry. She said, "People are usually sorry. It does not generally cause them to stand up in the middle of a formal proceeding and disrupt a 400-year-old rite." I almost smiled. So did she, I thought. Not quite, but almost. She said, "The houses will challenge the compact. They will use every mechanism available to them. The first challenge will likely come within 48 hours. There will be a tribunal process. It could take months." I said. "Then we had better figure out what we are doing with those months." She looked at me across the table with that Vel-Sharan assessment stillness, and this time I thought I could see something underneath it. Not warmth exactly. Not yet. But something that might become it. The specific quality of a person who has been operating alone for a long time and has just been presented with evidence, not quite believed yet, that they might not have to. She asked me if I understood Vel-Sharan law. I told her I had read the briefing packet twice. She said, "Then we have work to do." Outside the meeting room, Ambassador Gale was waiting. She told me that she had 3 more transmissions to respond to, and that the Home Office was using the phrase, "diplomatic incident," in every other sentence. She told me that the House of Velthoran had already filed a preliminary challenge to the compact. She told me that my dress uniform jacket had a small tear along the left shoulder seam that was going to be in every photograph taken today. I asked her if she thought I had done the right thing. She was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "I think you did a human thing. Whether it was right is going to depend on what you do next." I said, "Good. That's my favorite kind of answer." She asked me once what humans are. That question was still ahead of us then, still several months and several fights away. But sitting in that corridor outside a small meeting room on an iron-walled station at the edge of Vel'Sharan space, I thought I was beginning to understand what I would tell her when it arrived. She asked me if I understood the galaxy. I told her I usually figured that out on the way back out. For the first time, she almost smiled. The first challenge arrived in 31 hours, not 48. It came in the form of a formal legal filing from a coalition of 7 houses, submitted to the conclave legal body under a provision I had not heard of before that day, called the Kelvar Review Clause. The clause allowed a coalition of houses to petition for a formal review of any compact declaration made by a non-Vel'Sharan party, on the grounds that the declaring party may not have possessed sufficient legal understanding of the commitment being made. The argument, in plain language, was that I was too uninformed to have meant what I said, and therefore what I said should not count. The advocate who explained this to me had the carefully neutral expression of a professional who was trying not to have an opinion about something he clearly had an opinion about. I asked him whether the clause had been used before. He said yes, once, approximately 200 years ago, and that the review had taken 11 months and ultimately upheld the original compact. I said, "So they know this probably will not work." He said, "They know it will take time. In Vel'Sharan legal process, time is often the point." I understood. Delay long enough and the situation shifts. Delay long enough and political will erodes. Delay long enough and the person you are delaying against runs out of resources, or patience, or both. It was a strategy I recognized because it was not specific to the Vel'Sharan. It was simply what large established systems did when confronted with something they had not invited and did not want. Salvin and I had begun meeting daily by then. The conclave had provided us with a working space, 2 rooms adjacent to each other on the diplomatic tier of the station, with access to the conclave legal archive and a communications terminal. I arrived in the morning and she was usually already there. She did not seem to sleep much, or perhaps she slept at different hours. The Vel'Sharan had a longer natural sleep cycle than humans, but in shorter intervals, which meant she could be awake and working at times I found unexpected. She taught me Vel'Sharan law, the way that someone teaches you a language when there is not enough time to do it slowly. She did not simplify it. She gave it to me in its actual complexity, and trusted me to keep up. The legal structure of the Vel'Sharan conclave was built in layers. Original charter provisions dating back 4 centuries, amendment records, procedural supplements, and an enormous body of case precedent that was itself divided into binding precedent and advisory precedent, with complicated rules about when each applied. What I brought to this process was not legal training. What I brought was the habit of reading things carefully, that other people assumed were too dense to be worth reading. I had learned that habit in the military, where overlooking a detail in an operational document could have consequences that were immediate and physical. The legal archive was dense, yes. It was also searchable, and I could sit with a document for a long time and follow its cross-references until I had built a picture of how it connected to other things. I found the first useful thing on the 4th day. It was in the amendment records, not in the main charter. A provision added approximately 180 years ago, during a period of significant expansion in the conclave's recognized membership, that modified the Kelvar Review Clause in a specific way. The modification stated that a Kelvar review could not be initiated if the declaring party had been granted formal observer status by the conclave itself, on the grounds that observer status constituted a form of recognized standing. The reasoning in the legislative history was that granting observer status implied a level of legal acknowledgement that made it inconsistent to then claim the observer lacked sufficient understanding to make a legal declaration. Earth had observer status. I had Earth's observer credentials. I brought this to Salvin. She read the provision twice. Then she read the legislative history. Then she sat back and looked at the document on the screen in front of her, and she said, They either did not find this, or they believed no one else would. I said, I think they assumed we would not read that far. She looked at me with an expression I was beginning to recognize. Not quite surprise, because she was too controlled for surprise, but a particular quality of attention that meant she was updating her assessment of something. She said, You did not study law before this. I said, I studied paying attention. The provision was significant enough that Ambassador Gale agreed to take it directly to the conclave legal body, rather than waiting for the tribunal process to run its normal course. The legal body took 3 days to review the provision and the challenge simultaneously. Their finding was that the Kelvar review was procedurally invalid under the observer status modification. The challenge was dismissed. The coalition of 7 houses filed a secondary challenge within 12 hours. This one was more complex. It argued that the petition itself was improperly constructed, that the formal presentation of Princess Salvin's case had contained errors in the genealogical documentation required under conclave petition law, and that these errors rendered the petition void, which would in turn void the compact. If the petition was void, there was nothing for the compact to attach to. I read the genealogical documentation requirements that evening. They ran to 43 pages, with cross-references to a supplemental registry procedure that was itself 20 pages. It was dense work, and I did not finish until late. But when I did, I had found 2 things. First, the documentation Selvin had submitted was not in error. It was formatted using a legacy standard that was technically superseded, but that the supplemental registry procedure explicitly stated remained valid for petitions submitted by surviving members of houses whose registry records predated the current standard, which the Lunathari House records did. Second, the House of Veltheron, which was the most prominent member of the coalition filing these challenges, had itself submitted a petition 11 years ago using the same legacy standard without objection from any party. I found the record in the archive. It was not hard to find. It had simply, I suspected, not been looked for. I showed Selvin both findings. She was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, They filed that petition during the same period that they were maintaining a trade agreement with the house responsible for my people's situation. I said, I noticed that too. She said, If that connection is made formally in the tribunal record, it changes the character of their challenge. It becomes a pattern, not an argument. I said, That is what I was thinking. She looked at me across the table, and for the first time since we had begun working together, I saw something shift in her composure. Not a crack, more like a door opening slightly. She said, You are not what I expected you to be. I asked her what she had expected. She said, Someone doing this for a reason that would become clear later. Someone who would want something that had not yet been named. I have dealt with many sponsors in my career before this petition. They all wanted something. It was not always a bad thing. Sometimes wanting something is what creates alignment. But there was always a want. I said, There is still time for me to want something. She said, There is, but I am beginning to think there might not be. The second challenge collapsed when we presented both findings to the legal body. The body's response this time was notably different from the first. A senior advocate from the body contacted us directly, outside the formal process, and said, in careful language that technically communicated no opinion, that if we intended to present any additional findings in future proceedings, the body would appreciate receiving them with reasonable advance notice, as they were producing some administrative inconvenience. Ambassador Gale said that was as close to an unofficial apology as the Velsharan legal body was physically capable of producing. The coalition did not file a third challenge immediately. Instead, they shifted tactics. What followed was a period of indirect pressure that was harder to fight than a legal challenge because it produced no document to rebut. The House of Velthoran and its coalition began a campaign of social and diplomatic isolation. They declined to share communal facilities on the station with conclave members who had shown any sympathy toward the petition. They communicated privately with other houses, applying the kind of quiet social leverage that is invisible in records but very visible in behavior. Members of the conclave who had initially seemed neutral became suddenly unavailable. Meeting requests went unanswered. A dining invitation I had received from a minor House representative was cancelled without explanation. Elevin had seen this before. She described it without emotion, as a practical problem. This was, she explained, how the noble houses had always managed inconveniences that could not be removed legally. You made the inconvenience feel socially costly, until whoever was causing it chose to stop. I told her it would not work on me, because I did not have a social position here to lose. I had arrived with the standing of a nobody, and the social campaign was not going to reduce that. She said, "It is not aimed at you. It is aimed at Earth." She was right. Ambassador Gale began receiving questions from the Galactic Affairs Office about whether the diplomatic costs of the compact situation were beginning to outweigh the benefits. The language used was careful, but the meaning was clear. They were asking how much longer this was going to take. They were asking whether a managed exit was possible. I wrote a response to the Home Office myself and asked Ambassador Gale to transmit it. I kept it short. I said, "We are currently 2 challenges into a process that the other side expected to take 11 months. We resolved both challenges in under 3 weeks. We have found evidence of procedural misconduct by the challenging coalition that we have not yet introduced formally. We are not close to the end, but we are not where they planned for us to be. Request permission to continue." The response took 2 days. It was a single word: granted. I told Selvin. She said, "Your government is not entirely comfortable with this situation." I said, "No, but they have a complicated relationship with backing down from things. It is one of our more useful qualities." She looked at me with that almost smile. By now I could read it clearly. It arrived when I said something that surprised her, in a direction she had not prepared for. She asked me, "How do you know it will work? The tribunal, the evidence, all of it. How do you know it will be enough?" I told her the truth. I said, "I do not know. I know that it is correct. I know that the law, as it was written, supports you. I know that we have evidence of things they would prefer remain unexamined. Whether correct and evidenced is enough depends on whether the system is willing to follow its own rules when following them is inconvenient." She was quiet. Then she said, "That is not a certainty." I said, "No, but it is a foundation, and I have worked with worse." The tribunal date was set for 6 weeks out. We went back to the archive and kept reading. They expected me to be crushed by their systems. They forgot I was built by harder ones. The tribunal chamber was different from the petition hall. Smaller, designed for argument rather than ceremony, with a high bench for the 3 presiding arbiters and 2 advocate tables facing it. The gallery was open to any conclave member who wished to observe, which meant it was full. I had not expected a full gallery, but looking at it as we entered, I understood why they had come. This was not simply a legal proceeding anymore. It had become, in the weeks since the conclave session, something that people across the Velsharan network had opinions about. The news of the compact had spread through channels I had not anticipated. The Velsharan were a species with a rich tradition of political commentary, and a human observer invoking the Kelshar Compact at a petition closing ceremony was, by any measure, political commentary worth discussing. There were voices that found it presumptuous, evidence of humanity's characteristic inability to understand its own limitations. There were voices that found it interesting. There were voices, and this surprised me when Ambassador Gale showed me the transmissions, coming from populations outside the noble class, from the vast majority of Velsharan people who were not noble house members, and from members of other species who observed the conclave network, that were something closer to supportive. I did not think about the gallery when we sat down at the advocate table. I thought about the 3 arbiters on the high bench, and the 37 pages of notes I had prepared, and the 7 specific pieces of evidence I intended to introduce, and the order in which introducing them would be most effective. Selvin sat beside me as co-party to the compact. She had never sat at the advocate table before. Her previous tribunal experiences, she had told me, had been as a petitioner, represented by hired advocates. She sat with the same composure she had carried into the petition hall, but I noticed, because I had learned to notice, that her hands were very still, the stillness of someone managing something. I placed my notes on the table and looked at the bench. The lead arbiter was a woman named Velshan of the conclave legal body. No house affiliation, a career jurist who had served on the high bench for 19 years. I had read 4 of her previous determinations in the archive. She was precise, she was consistent, and she had, in each of the 4 cases I had read, found against the more powerful party when the evidence favored the weaker one. I did not assume this was a pattern I could rely on, but it was information. The coalition's advocate stood to present the consolidated challenge. He was a senior legal professional named Kethvar, known in conclave circles as a formidable procedural technician. I had read his filings. He was good. He argued with the specific quality of someone who has so thoroughly mastered the terrain that he sometimes forgot the audience did not share his mastery, and occasionally used language that was accurate but inaccessible. I noted this and decided it might be useful. Kethvar's argument was a consolidated version of the previous 2 challenges plus a third ground, that the practical implications of upholding the compact were so significant, the establishment of a new precedent for non-Velsharan observers standing in petition rights, the formal recognition of a houseless petitioner, that the bench should apply a heightened standard of scrutiny before allowing it to proceed. Heightened scrutiny. I had been waiting for that phrase. It appeared in exactly one place in Velsharan tribunal law, in a provision that defined it, and that definition included a specific limitation. Heightened scrutiny could not be applied to compact declarations that had already survived 2 procedural challenges without modification. The compact had survived 2 challenges without modification. When it was my turn, I said this immediately. I did not build to it. I opened with it, citing the provision number and subsection, and then I said that because the heightened scrutiny argument was therefore procedurally unavailable, we could proceed to the substance of the remaining questions, which I believe the bench would find significantly less complex than the coalition had presented them as being. The gallery was quiet. Kethvar looked at me with an expression that was professionally controlled, and underneath the control was something sharp. The lead arbiter asked the coalition to respond to the provision citation. Kethvar responded that the limitation did not apply because the previous challenges had been dismissed on procedural grounds rather than substantive ones, and the relevant provision specified challenges that had been heard on substance. I had anticipated this. I had the relevant case record from 140 years ago, in which the distinction between procedural and substantive dismissal had been specifically addressed by a previous bench and found to be inapplicable to the limitation. I cited the case. I gave the archive reference. I gave the page number. The arbiter asked the coalition to respond to the case citation. Kethvar took a longer pause this time, not long enough to be visible to most of the gallery, but long enough that I noticed he said, the case was distinguishable on specific grounds, and began to outline them. I let him finish. Then I said politely that 3 of the 4 distinguishing grounds he had cited were addressed directly in the case's legislative commentary, which was included in the archive reference I had provided, and that the 4th distinguishing ground was factually inaccurate. The records showed that the party in the cited case had been granted observer status of the same class as Earth's, contrary to what Kethvar had just stated. The gallery was very quiet now. The lead arbiter asked whether the coalition wished to submit any documentary evidence in support of the factual claim. Kethvar said they would need time to review the relevant records. The arbiter gave them 15 minutes. I did not look at the gallery during the recess. I looked at my notes. Salvin leaned toward me slightly and said, very quietly, "You prepared for that specifically." I said, "I prepared for everything I could find." That one seemed likely. She said, "How long did this take you?" I said, "Most of 3 weeks. There was a lot of material." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "My advocates, before I lost my house, used to charge for preparation time by the hour. The best of them spent approximately 2 weeks preparing for a major tribunal. They were very good." I said, I had more motivation than hourly billing. She looked at me. That door opened a little further. When the recess ended, Kethvar acknowledged that the factual claim required revision and withdrew that specific distinguishing ground. The lead arbiter noted the withdrawal for the record in a tone that communicated, without editorial comment, that she had noticed. I introduced the 7 pieces of evidence in the order I had planned: the legacy documentation standard, the Veltharan petition from 11 years ago, 3 records from the Conclave archive showing that the 2 houses responsible for the territorial dispute that destroyed the Lunathari homeworld had maintained active trade agreements with 3 of the 7 coalition members at the time of the incident. 1 record showing that the formal notification of the Lunathari disaster had been received by the Conclave registry and filed without action for 4 months before any administrative response was initiated. And the final piece, a provision in the original charter, predating all amendments, that defined the purpose of the Kelshar petition right as ensuring that no recognized people could be rendered voiceless before the conclave through circumstances beyond their control. I read that provision aloud in its original Velsharan, because my pronunciation was imperfect, but my comprehension was accurate, and because something about hearing the original language in that room seemed important. Sailvin had coached me on the pronunciation the previous evening. When I finished reading it, I looked at the bench and said that the evidence we had presented showed this was exactly the situation the right was designed to address, and that voiding the compact would be a finding that this provision of the original charter did not mean what it clearly said. The gallery had a sound then, not noise, something quieter, the specific quality of a group of people who have arrived at the same thought at the same moment. Kethvar responded, and he was careful and thorough, and he found several points that required my counter-response, and I gave them, and we went back and forth in the way that tribunal argument works when both sides are actually prepared, building a record that the bench would use to write their determination. It took 4 hours total. The lead arbiter said the bench would deliberate and issue a written determination. She gave a timeline of 5 to 7 days. When we left the chamber, the gallery members who had attended were in the corridors, and several of them moved aside in a way that was very different from how they had treated me when I first arrived at this station. I noticed but did not comment on it. Ambassador Gale met us outside. She said, "That was the most methodical thing I have ever watched." She did not specify whether she meant it as a compliment. I think she meant it as an observation, which in her register was probably higher praise. Sailvin and I walked back to our working space in silence for most of the way. At the door, she stopped and turned to me and said, "The arbiters will rule fairly. I believe that now. I did not believe it 2 months ago." I said, "What changed?" She said, "You showed me the record. The law, as written, is fair. It has not always been applied fairly. But you showed me that it exists, that the fair version of it exists, and that it is possible to make the application match the text if you are willing to do the work of finding every place they diverge." I said, "Someone should have done that work a long time ago." She said, "Yes. They should have." The arbiter asked how a species 4 decades into space law had found what their scholars had not in 4 centuries. I told her, "We looked. We simply looked, because we thought it mattered. The determination arrived in 4 days, not 7. I read it first, because it was delivered to the working space's communication terminal, at a time when Sailvin was in a separate meeting with a conclave registry official. I read it standing at the terminal, and then I read it again sitting down. The formal language required translation from legal Velsharan, and I was careful to make sure I was reading it correctly before I let myself respond to it. The compact was upheld. All challenges were dismissed. The petition was declared procedurally valid. The coalition of 7 houses was formally noted in the record as having filed a challenge withdrawn on factual grounds, which was the Velsharan legal record's precise and devastating way of saying that they had stated something in tribunal that was not true. The arbiters recommended a full inquiry into the events surrounding the destruction of the Lunathari home system, to be conducted by the conclave investigative body, with access to all relevant trade and communications records. That last part was the one I read 3 times. A full inquiry with access to all relevant records, meant that the trade agreements, the timing of notifications, the specific decisions made by specific houses in the period around the Lunathari disaster, all of it would now be subject to formal examination. That was not something the coalition had anticipated when they filed the challenge. By fighting the compact through tribunal, they had created a formal record that now gave the investigative body the grounds to request materials they had no previous mechanism to access. I thought about whether I had seen that possibility clearly when I introduced the trade agreement records. I thought about it honestly, because honesty in your own assessment is the only way to actually learn from a situation. The truth was, I had seen it partially. I had introduced the records because they were relevant, and because they told the truth about what had happened. I had understood that making them part of the formal record was significant. I had not fully anticipated the specific mechanism by which that significance would compound. The inquiry authorization was a better outcome than I had planned for. When Salvin returned, I told her the result directly, and let her read the determination herself. I watched her read it. I watched her reach the part about the inquiry authorization and stop, and read that section again, and then sit still for a long moment. She did not cry. I am not sure, actually, whether Vels Sharan cry in the way humans do. But there was something in her stillness that carried a weight I recognized, the weight of someone who has held something for so long that the first moment of release is almost harder than the holding was. She said, after a while, "It will take time, the inquiry. It could take years." I said, "Yes." She said, "The houses responsible may have ways of managing the process." I said, "The record is public now. That makes managing it harder." She said, "It does not bring them back." I said, "No, it does not." That was a thing I did not try to soften or reroute. She was right, and the rightness of it deserved to sit without response. After a while she said, "But it means they existed, that what was done to them is visible, that the record of the galaxy will say what happened and who knew about it. That is not nothing." I said, "No, it is not nothing at all." The practical consequences arrived quickly after the determination. Earth's Galactic Affairs Office, which had been using the phrase diplomatic incident for 2 months, switched to a different phrase in their transmissions. The phrase was strategic positioning, and its appearance told me that someone in the Home Office had recalculated. The tribunal proceedings had been carried on the Conclave network. The determination had been carried on the Conclave network. The moment when I had read the original charter provision aloud in the tribunal chamber had been replicated in commentary pieces across 14 different inhabited systems. Earth was no longer a footnote in the conclave. Earth was something that the networks were actively discussing. What they were discussing, specifically, was the question of what humans were. Not in a hostile sense. That question had been asked about humans in hostile ways before, and this was different. It was being asked with genuine curiosity, by a population of galactic citizens who had just watched a human spend 2 months in an archive reading Velsharan law, until he understood it well enough to find the things the Velsharan themselves had chosen not to look at. It was the question of what kind of species does that, and why. Ambassador Gale said to me, during one of our daily briefings, "You understand that you have changed something, yes? Not just for Salvin and the petition, for how this species is perceived." I said, "I understood that." She said, "It will create expectations. People will expect humans to behave consistently with what they have just seen. That is not always comfortable." I said, "That seems like a problem worth having." She almost smiled. I had started to notice that Ambassador Gale smiled approximately as rarely as Selvin did, and with similar quality when she did. The hostile coalition did not collapse immediately after the determination. Institutions of that size and established power do not collapse easily, and I had never expected them to. What shifted was their calculation. For 4 months, their calculation had been, apply maximum procedural pressure, and the compact will fail under its own weight. That calculation had produced 2 dismissed challenges, a tribunal defeat, and a formal record note about a factual withdrawal. The new calculation was, I suspected, something more cautious, something that started with the recognition that a thing they had assumed was manageable had turned out to be more complicated than assumed. 3 of the 7 coalition houses quietly withdrew from active participation in the consolidated challenge process within 2 weeks of the determination. They issued no public statements. They simply became less present. In Velcheron diplomatic terms, this was the equivalent of a significant concession. The act of withdrawal communicated, to anyone who understood the social language, that they had assessed the situation and determined that continued association with the challenge was costing more than it was gaining. The remaining 4 houses maintained their position, but their position was now significantly weaker, and everyone in the conclave knew it. Seilvan received formal provisional recognition from the conclave registry 6 weeks after the determination. It was provisional because the full inquiry had not yet concluded, and the formal restoration of the Lunathari House status was dependent on the inquiry's findings. But provisional recognition meant she had legal standing. It meant she could participate in conclave proceedings. It meant she could file further petitions, enter formal agreements, and exist in the Velcheron legal record as a real party rather than as a petitioner without status. On the day the provisional recognition was issued, she came to the working space in the morning, and she was carrying something. It was small, held in both hands, and it was unlike anything I had seen before. It appeared to be a key of some kind, not a physical locking mechanism, but the Velcheron concept of a key, which was an object that represented the opening of something, rather than the mechanism of opening it. It was made of a material that seemed to shift slightly depending on angle, catching light and returning it in a pattern that was close to but not quite like any pattern I had seen in other materials. She placed it on the table between us. She said, "In Lunathari tradition, this is called a telshar. It is given to someone you trust with your grief, not someone who fixes your grief, or who takes it from you. Someone who is permitted to know that it exists. It is the deepest form of acknowledgement my people had for another person." I looked at the object on the table. Then I looked at her. She said, "I know you did not ask for it. I know you will not know what to do with it. Neither do I, entirely, because there is no one left who would have taught me the ceremony that accompanies giving it. So I am giving it to you without the ceremony, which is probably not correct, but I think the tradition would understand." I said, "I will treat it carefully." She said, "I know." I picked it up. It was lighter than it looked, and warmer, as though it had been held recently, or perhaps that was its nature. I placed it in the inside pocket of my jacket, where it sat against my chest with that warmth. She said, "They will not stop. The 4 remaining houses, they will find new approaches." I said, "I know." She said, "It may still fail. The inquiry, the restoration. There are many steps and each one can be disrupted." I said, "Yes." She said, "But you are not going to stop either." It was not a question. I said, "No, I am not." She nodded once, with the quality of someone who has confirmed something they already knew. I filed my regular report to Earth that evening. 1 paragraph was the formal summary of the provisional recognition and its implications. The final lines were personal, which was not standard diplomatic report format. But Ambassador Gale had stopped correcting my report format 3 weeks into the process, when she had decided that results were more important than format. I wrote, "They asked what advantage we gained. Tell them the truth. None that they will understand yet, but the kind that compounds." The Grand Conclave had not been convened in 94 years. Convening it required a formal petition from any 3 recognized houses, each holding status above a specific tier, submitted simultaneously to the conclave registry, with a declared agenda item. The agenda item submitted by the 4 remaining coalition houses was straightforward in its language, and remarkable in its ambition. A motion to revoke the observer status of the human species within the Velcheron conclave, citing the disruption of established procedural norms, and the creation of destabilizing precedent in the petition rights system. When Ambassador Gale showed me the filing, she was watching my face carefully. I think she expected a particular reaction. I read the document twice, and then I said, "Can I file a counter motion?" She blinked once. Then she said, "Under the Grand Conclave Charter, yes. Any party with recognized standing can file a counter motion for the agenda of a Grand Conclave session. The counter motion is heard before the primary motion. What are you thinking of filing?" I said, "The Kelshar Reformation." She said, "Explain." I said, "The petition right, as it currently exists, provides access to compact protections for houseless Velsharan petitioners. What it does not provide is access to any form of conclave recognition or protective status for peoples who are not Velsharan and whose home systems may be in Velsharan adjacent space or under Velsharan influence. I want to file a motion to extend compact protections to all peoples recognized by the conclave who do not hold house status, regardless of species." Ambassador Gale was quiet for a long time. The kind of quiet that meant serious thinking, not the kind that meant no. She said, "That would be the most significant expansion of conclave jurisdiction in its history." I said, "Yes." She said, "The 4 coalition houses will oppose it with everything they have." I said, "They were going to oppose us with everything they have anyway. The Grand Conclave is already being convened. We did not ask for that. But we can decide what happens inside it." She said, "If it fails, it will be a very public failure." I said, "If the expulsion motion passes without a counter, it will also be a very public failure. One of those two things has a different ending." She looked at me for a long moment. Then she said, "I need authorization from the Home Office for something of this scale." I said, "I know. Will you request it?" She said, "Yes. And Callum, when you told me, on the first day, that you stood up in that hall without a strategy, I believed you. I want you to know that I do not believe you anymore." I thought about that. Then I said, "I did not have a strategy when I stood up. What I had was a habit. Once you start, you keep going. The strategy comes from the going." She said, "That is a very human answer." I said, "We are a very human species." The authorization arrived in 18 hours, which was faster than anything the Galactic Affairs Office had produced since this process began. I understood what the speed meant. Someone in the Home Office had read the filing from the Coalition, had understood what it represented, and had made a decision about what kind of species Earth intended to be. I was glad to know they had made the right one. I filed the Kelshar Reformation that afternoon. The reaction was immediate. The Coalition responded publicly within 6 hours, calling the counter-motion an overreach and a provocation. 3 minor houses that had been quiet throughout the previous months issued statements opposing it. 2 houses that had also been quiet issued statements that were more carefully worded. Not supportive exactly, but noting the legal basis of the motion, which in political language was a form of partial endorsement. Salvin read the counter-motion when I showed it to her. She read the whole thing, which was long, because I had written it carefully, and with extensive legal citations. When she finished, she said, "You named my people in the preamble." I said, "Yes." She said, "And the Lunathari home system is listed as the primary example case." I said, "It is the case that began this process. It belongs in the document that might end it." She said, "If this passes, it will not just be about me. It will establish protections for peoples across the conclave territory who have never had access to this kind of standing." I said, "That is the point." She was quiet. Then she said, "Callum, I need to speak at the Grand Conclave. Formally, as co-sponsor of the counter-motion, and as the petitioner whose case opened this process, I need to be heard in my own voice, not represented through legal filings." I said, "I know. That is why your name is on the filing as co-sponsor, not just as the originating petitioner." She said, "I have not spoken formally at the conclave in its full assembly. Before this process, I did not have standing to do so." I said, "You have standing now." The Grand Conclave session was scheduled for 4 weeks out. The chamber was the petition hall, expanded for the occasion. Additional gallery tiers had been deployed, extending the capacity significantly. This was not a session for the noble houses only. Under the Grand Conclave rules, any Velcheron citizen and any species with conclave observer status was permitted to attend or to access the transmitted proceedings. The transmitted proceedings were the part that I had not fully considered when I filed the counter-motion. Ambassador Gale explained it to me 2 weeks before the session. The Grand Conclave transmission went to every active receiver on the Conclave network. That network reached not just the noble houses, but the full population of Velcheron space, and by extension, every species with observer status or trade-linked access to the network. The session would be watched by a number of people that was difficult to express as anything other than most of the known inhabited galaxy. I spent the 4 weeks in preparation, the same way I had spent the past months. I read, I followed cross-references, I prepared for arguments I had not yet heard, by working through every position the coalition might take, and building the response to each one. Salvin prepared her address. I heard portions of it when she practiced it in the working space in the evenings, and I did not interrupt her because it was not mine to shape her voice. In those sessions, had a quality I had not heard in our ordinary conversations. She was not performing, she was excavating, finding the words for things that had lived inside her in silence for 12 years. Ambassador Gale and I prepared the political ground in parallel. The 2 houses that had issued careful statements were cultivated quietly. 3 additional houses were approached through indirect channels, identified through archive records as having historical grievances with the coalition's primary members. The species with observer status were not formally lobbied. That was outside the scope of conclave procedure, but information about the counter-motion, its legal basis and its scope, was made available through every open channel. The morning of the Grand Conclave session, I arrived at the hall of 100 houses before anyone else was inside. I stood in the empty chamber for a few minutes. The iron walls were the same. The air still tasted of that cold metal quiet, but the gallery tiers were extended now, filling space that had been wall when I arrived here months ago, and the light in the chamber was slightly different. The transmission arrays had been set up, positioned to capture the entire floor and bench, and they added a faint supplemental brightness to the existing light. I had stood in this room as a footnote. I was still, formally, Earth's diplomatic attaché. The title had not changed, but the room had changed, and the title's meaning inside it had changed. And I stood there in that empty space for a few minutes, and let myself understand that. Then people began arriving, and I found my seat, and the session began. The coalition presented the expulsion motion first, as the primary agenda item. Kethvar argued it. He was, as he had always been, technically thorough. He presented the expulsion as a matter of procedural integrity. The conclave's established norms had been disrupted. The precedent created by the compact was potentially destabilizing, and the appropriate response to a species that had disrupted those norms was a formal reconsideration of that species' status within the conclave framework. I noticed that his argument did not mention, at any point, the content of what I had argued. It did not engage with the evidence I had introduced, the trade records, the suppressed case history, the charter provision. It spoke about disruption of norms and destabilizing precedent, without specifying which norms or what the precedent destabilized. That was, I thought, a sign of what they actually feared. Not the compact, but the record. Not my presence, but what my presence had caused to be entered into the formal documentation of the conclave. Then Salvin stood up. She walked to the petitioner dais, the same dais she had stood on months ago, and she stood with her hands visible and her head level, and the same composure she had always carried. But this time, she was not waiting for a response. She was giving one. She spoke for 40 minutes. I am not going to try to reproduce it, because the Velcheron she used had qualities that do not translate fully, and because it was hers and not mine to transcribe. What I can say is that she spoke about the Lunathari, not about law, not about procedure, not about the conclave's role or responsibility. She spoke about her people as people, about the cities that sang, about the way their culture had built its entire aesthetic around the idea that beauty could be structural, that a building could be both shelter and music. She spoke about what it means to be the last of something, To carry a language in your memory knowing no one else will ever speak it to you again. She spoke about what happened in that hall, months ago, when she stood on the dais and waited, and the silence stretched, and the closing sequence began, and a human she had never met stood up and scraped a chair against the iron floor. She said, "I had prepared myself to leave this chamber with nothing. I had decided that I would survive that, because I had survived worse. What I had not prepared for was someone deciding that the silence was not acceptable, not for strategic reasons, not for political gain, simply because they could not sit inside it." The gallery was very still. She said, "This counter-motion is not about one people or one petition. It is about whether this conclave's law means what it says. The original charter was written to ensure that no recognized people could be rendered voiceless through circumstances beyond their control. My people had no control over what happened to them. They were voiceless in this hall for 12 years, one human. Without standing, without legal training, without anything except the decision that the silence was wrong. Changed that. If the Kelshar Reformation passes, it will mean that no people in conclave space will ever have to wait for one human to happen to be in the room." Silence. Then the gallery moved. Not loudly. This was still a Velsharan assembly, and it was still formal, and the Velsharan did not express collective feeling the way humans sometimes did. But there was a shift in the room's quality, something that traveled through the tiers, and was visible in how people held themselves. And I felt it as clearly as I had felt the weight of 10,000 eyes on me. On the day I first stood up, I presented the counter-motion's legal framework. I did it efficiently. This was not the moment for extended argument. The legal case had been built over months and was in the record. I cited the key provisions. I introduced the Reformation text. I made the argument that the expulsion motion and the counter-motion could not coexist. You could not expel a species for revealing that the law meant something larger than the coalition preferred, while simultaneously claiming commitment to the principles the law expressed. The debate that followed lasted 3 hours. Houses argued. Counter-arguments were made. 4 houses that had been identified through our preparation voted with the counter-motion in the formal alignment declarations that preceded the full vote. 2 additional houses, which we had not specifically cultivated, declared alignment at the last moment. One of them a house with a long and quiet history of grievance against the Velthoran that I had found in the archive, and not been certain enough about to pursue, and which had apparently decided this was the moment to make that history visible. The vote was not unanimous. I had not expected it to be the 4 coalition houses voted against. 6 houses voted against with them. It was not a small opposition, but it was not a majority. The expulsion motion failed. The Kelshar Reformation passed. Imperfect, compromised in several of the specific provisions during the debate process, but passed. And real. The hall of 100 houses had exactly one moment of noise. A sound that rose from the gallery tiers and the extended sections, and from somewhere in the transmission network that was somehow audible even in the chamber, though I knew that was not technically possible. That what I was hearing was an idea of the sound rather than the sound itself. And then the formality of the proceeding reasserted itself, and the sound became something quieter, something that lived in the way people moved and looked at each other. I sat at the advocate table, and I took a breath. Selvin sat beside me. She did not say anything immediately. Neither did I. The determination was being recorded by the herald. The procedural business of the session's conclusion moved forward around us. After a while she said, "The inquiry will continue. The home system status petition will be filed. There is still much to do." I said, "Yes." She said, "The 4 houses will not forgive this." I said, "No, but they will recalculate. And the new calculation is different from the old one." She said, "Because of the record." I said, "Because of the record." Because what happened in this hall is public and documented, and part of the history now. Because the people who were watching, not the noble houses, the actual people watching, have seen what the law can do when someone is willing to apply it. That is harder to undo than a decision. She reached into the formal sash of her presentation robes, and she brought out a second Telshar. It was identical to the one she had given me weeks ago, or close to it. Perhaps a slightly different weight, a slightly different quality in the way it returned light. She held it in both hands for a moment. Then she said, "This was my mother's. I have carried it since she was gone. In Lunathari tradition, when you give a telshar, you do not give it empty. You fill it first with a frequency, a thought, a memory, something of meaning that the material holds and that the recipient carries with it." She said, "I do not know if I believe in that anymore, after everything, but I filled this one this morning. I want you to have it." I took it. It was warm, like the first one. I said, "What did you fill it with?" She said, "The sound of the city where I grew up. The harmonic of the central plaza, on a morning when the wind was from the south. I have it in my memory exactly. I do not know if a telshar can actually hold a sound, but I put it there anyway." I held the object in my hands and I thought about a city that sang. I thought about the chair scraping on iron. I said, "I will carry it." Ambassador Gale found us outside the chamber. She said the Home Office transmissions had started before the session formally concluded, which was a pace she had not seen in 20 years of diplomatic work. She said the Galactic Affairs Office was using the phrase, "historic moment," which meant they had fully switched sides from diplomatic incident and were not going to admit it. I asked her if she was happy with how it had gone. She said, "Happy is not the word I use for things like this. The word is important. This was important." I said, "Yes, it was." She said, "You are going to receive a formal commendation from the Secretary General's office. I have been asked to tell you to look professionally surprised when it is announced." I said, "I will practice." She almost smiled. I filed my final report that evening. The formal summary was thorough. The vote totals, the reformation provisions, the next steps in the inquiry process, and the home system petition. It took 3 pages and it covered everything that a diplomatic report was supposed to cover. The last paragraph was not formal. It was the one I had told Ambassador Gale to transmit as is. And she had agreed. And it read, "They asked what advantage we gained. Tell them the truth. None that they will understand yet, but the kind that compounds. They asked what humans are. I have been turning that question over since Selvin first posed it to me in a small meeting room on an iron-walled station, a few hours after I had stood up without a strategy and changed both our lives. I think humans are the species that cannot sit in the wrong kind of silence. I think we learned, in the long centuries before we made it to the stars, that silence of a certain kind is not peace. It is permission, given to something that should not be permitted. I think we are, at our best, profoundly allergic to looking away. It does not always make us easy to be around. It does not always make us wise or careful or correct, but it makes us, when the moment requires it, the species that stands up. I did not step forward because I understood the galaxy. I stepped forward because I had grown up in a place the galaxy forgot, and I knew exactly what it felt like to stand in that silence, waiting for someone, anyone, to move. And I have never been very good at waiting.